Things would be even worse off the gridiron. By the middle of the season, the President of the United States would all but urge Snyder to reconsider the name of his football team. And the simple statement meant to end the discussion instead helped ignite a major controversy that enveloped Snyder and his team. The stonewall by the NFL and the Washington team was shattered this year. Ray Halberter, a representative from the Oneida Indian Nation, which conducted a wide-ranging campaign against the team's name throughout the 2013 season, said it's a permanent movement now. And it's a movement with increasing chances of success. But even as changes close in on the DC team, emails between team advisors obtained by Think Progress reveal a deep contempt for the arguments that may ultimately cost the franchise its name. The etymology of that offensive R word is, according to a study from the Smithsonian Institute Native American language historian Yves Goddard, entirely benign. Native Americans, Goddard found, were the originators of the term, which they used to set themselves apart from people new to their land. By the early 1860s, however, whites had co-opted the term as a racial descriptor and, at very worst, a slur. 16 years later, a United States Army captain named Richard Henry Pratt founded Carlisle Indian School, one of the first in a wave of Indian boarding schools meant to help the United States government solve its, quote, Indian problem. Many whites at the time believed that the only way to deal with Indians was to educate and assimilate them into Eurocentric American culture. Indians could be, quote, saved, but only if whites eradicated their cultural backgrounds. Carlisle, in the words of its founder, existed to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. Carlisle sat on an abandoned military base and existed under the authority of the United States Army. The school found little success in educating Indians, but it excelled in replacing Indian traditions and beliefs with the English language, Western religion, and American culture. This was especially true on the football field, where Carlisle ascended to the top of America's new burgeoning obsession, collegiate football. Carlisle regularly competed with and beat the powers of the day. Ivy League schools like Harvard and Yale, and military academies like Army, although they were officially known as the Red Men or Indians. Newspaper reports referred to its players by another name. By the second decade of the 20th century, Carlisle had spawned numerous other Indian boarding schools, which decades later would fall under criticism for their curriculum and cultural assimilation programs. Some who attended such schools remembered them as repressive institutions that destroyed their culture and provide little in the way of actual education. Carlisle closed in 1918. 14 years later, the team that is known today as the Washington team played its first professional football game. The Boston Braves, as they were known then, adopted the R-word name after just one season. As legend holds, the team changed names to honor its second coach, a burly Indian man named William Lone Star Dietz. The team moved to Washington in 1937. It has called the nation's capital home ever since. Dietz, in the organization's version of the story, was a Sioux, and the team adopted its name out of respect for American Native heritage and tradition, it said. The R-Word team have used that story to defend the name for decades. It plays a central role in Snyder's defense of the moniker now. Dietz's true identity remains a bone of contention. Author and historian Linda M. Wagner wrote in her exhaustive effort to debunk Dietz's claims of Indian heritage in the spring of 2013. But his birth certificate stated that he was born to German parents in Wisconsin. It was only later that Dietz adopted the story of his Indian heritage. Wagner's research suggests that he did so for self-promotional reasons, first to help him sell his talents as an artist, and later to help him gain prominence as both a football coach and a film creator. Dietz gained entry into the Carlisle School. As an acquaintance put it, through some subterfuge in 1907, Wagner found that he was likely among the players illegally recruited to Carlisle for football purposes. At this point, Dietz, quote, began crafting himself a fabulous autobiography. Wagner found he appeared to have made up an astoundingly anachronistic Indian heritage that cribbed heavily from an Indian name, James One Star, who had left Carlisle in the 1890s and, based on government records, likely died a soldier. His heritage had gotten him into Carlisle. His time at Carlisle helped launch his coaching career. He went on to work at, among other places, Washington State and Purdue. In 1933, he joined the D.C. team with the R word. His tenure there was hardly outstanding. In Dietz's 2 seasons as coach, his team's record stood at 11 wins, 11 losses, and 2 ties. And Dietz's story about his heritage was already in doubt before he joined the team. It actually caught up to him the year after Carlisle closed in 1918. A Washington State-based FBI agent investigated Dietz, and he was charged in 1919 for attempting to dodge the World War I draft by falsely registering as an Indian, and for misrepresenting a business he ran. He disputed the charges during a trial that ended with a hung jury. He pleaded no contest to new charges of lying about his heritage and misrepresenting his business and served 30 days in jail. Upon his release, he stuck to the story until the day he died. The D.C. team and the team's owner, George Preston Marshall, may not have been aware of his backstory. Still, Wagner found little evidence from the time to support the claim that Washington chose the Redskins name, specifically to honor Dietz, although it changed names when it hired him and before he coached his first season. Wagner's research instead claims that the name was probably a ploy to cash in on Indian football nostalgia, a phenomenon Carlisle helped create, home to football legends like Jim Thorpe. A member of the Sac and Fox Nation, Carlisle helped foster the belief that Native Americans had supernatural athletic talent, particularly on the football field. Dietz died in 1964, 3 decades after his short stint with the D.C. team, and right around the time the movement against Native American imagery in sports began. In the early 1960s, groups of Native American activists and students began working with colleges and universities to change names and drop mascots. And by 1970, they had won their first prominent victory. That year, the University of Oklahoma banished Little Red, an unofficial Native American mascot, from the Sooners football games. For the first time, an American sports team had listened to Native Americans who were arguing that it was inappropriate to make caricatures of their people for the entertainment of sports fans. Marquette University dropped its Native mascot in 1971. It would take 23 years for it to change its Warriors nickname. Stanford University dropped its Indians nickname the next year. In 1974, Dartmouth College's Board of Trustees decided the school should quit using its unofficial Indians nickname and imagery. The offensive name Redskins could have been next. I am Fripp. We are kicking ass. As Oklahoma banned Little Red, the R-Word team underwent a transition of their own. Owner George Preston Marshall died in 1969. The Redskins were left in the hands of Washington-based attorney Edward Bennett Williams, who owned a minority stake in the team that became its managing partner. Native American activists who wanted the name changed thought the new leadership presented an opportunity. Susan Shone Harjo, a member of the Cheyenne and Hoolity-Muskogee tribes, was one of those activists. Harjo said she watched from the sidelines as activists persuaded Oklahoma to change, but she followed them into the fight. Fast forward to 1974. Canadian media entrepreneur Jack Kent Cooke becomes the team's majority owner, and its name was still the R word. Cooke refused to meet with Native leaders. So did Daniel Snyder, the businessman who bought the team in 1999. According to Susan Schoen Harjo, Williams remains the last team owner to meet face-to-face with those who wanted the name changed. Over the 2 decades following the initial meeting, Harjo and other activists sought ways to target the name, both legally and in the court of public opinion. The activists considered various lawsuits challenging the name on civil rights grounds, but feared that they would only end in crushing and expensive defeats. They had little idea how to proceed. Then in January 1992, the R-Word team from D.C. won the Super Bowl. Super Bowl 26, played in Minneapolis, was the third and last championship the franchise won under Cooke's stewardship. The game is more notable because it sparked a thought in the mind of a Twin Cities-based patent lawyer named Stephen Baird, who was working on a law review article and contacted Harjo for an interview. Harjo said Baird asked a simple question in the course of their talks. Why had she and her fellow activists rejected the idea of challenging the team's federally protected trademark? A 1946 law known as the Lanham Act, she learned during their conversation, contained an obscure provision that gives the United States Patent and Trademark Office the authority to deny trademark protections when the terms used may be disparaging. Harjo said, "It wasn't that we rejected them. It was, I'd never heard that argument." The strategy was promising enough for Harjo, the Morning Star Institute, for which she founded to promote Native American culture and help rid sports of Native stereotypes, and other groups like NCAI to adopt. They went to work recruiting Native Americans who found the name offensive enough to join a lawsuit against it. In September 1992, 7 months after the Redskins won Super Bowl 26, Harjo and her co-plaintiffs, 7 of them in all, petitioned the United States Patent and Trademark Office's Trial and Appeals Board, asking it to invalidate the R-word trademark. The media took notice of their efforts. Washington Post columnist Tony Kornheiser called for a name change, and others did too, giving the movement a new source of momentum. When the team responded months later, it dismissed the suits, alleging that it was without merit and the appeals board should toss it aside. In 1999, nearly 7 years later, the trademark board agreed with the plaintiffs, finding that the word Redskins violated the Lanham Act and as such should lose its trademark pending appeal. That year, a young, wealthy businessman named Daniel Snyder bought the team, a move that instilled hope in the activists again. Among the factors that made the activists optimistic was Snyder's Judaism, which they thought might make him open to the concerns of another minority group. It wasn't so. Snyder, like Cooke before him, refused to consider a change. The franchise went about running out the clock on whatever momentum had risen against it. The team continued to defend its name as a tradition and an honor, and throughout the fight, it had another major motivation for preserving the name: money. The R-Word team are a brand, one carefully crafted over 80 years and among one of the most recognizable in sports. Although there are disputes over how much changing the name would cost, the team argued as part of the trademark case that it would cause, quote, every imaginable loss you could think of. If the team didn't have to rebrand, why would it willingly accept such an expensive undertaking? 4 years later, in 2003, a district court judge overturned the trademark board's decision, agreeing with the R-Word team that the plaintiffs had waited too long to file their complaint. The office issued the trademark in 1967, 25 years before the 7 plaintiffs filed their case. Why hadn't they been offended for years before, the judge reasoned? Why were they offended now? The youngest plaintiff, an artist named Mateo Romero, was just a year old when the original trademark was granted. To the court, it didn't matter. For 7 more years, the case wound its way through appeals. The Supreme Court refused to hear the plaintiff's appeal in 2009. The case was dead. The name Harjo spent decades fighting was not. Harjo wasn't going away. In between appeals, she recruited new plaintiffs to bring the same case. The new group, led by Amanda Blackhorse, was younger. Young enough, Harjo and the others had hoped, to avoid what they thought was a trivial technicality that had derailed their previous victory. If the trademark suit felt like a loss, it was actually one of the few the community had suffered since it started fighting the use of Native American imagery in sports. Students, parents, and Native Americans alike successfully argued for name changes in school districts and states across the country. A number of state boards of education have conducted a system-wide review of every Native American mascot in use in their schools. Miami University in Ohio, named after the Miami tribe, changed its name from the R-Word to Redhawks in 1997. High schools across the country made similar changes, dumping R-Word and other names in favor of new monikers. In 2005, the NCAA passed a bylaw prohibiting schools from wearing any logo it deemed hostile or abusive toward Native Americans on uniforms during postseason play. Schools with such mascots wouldn't be allowed to bring them to postseason games. As a result, the University of Illinois, with much consternation, dropped its iconic Chief Illiniwek mascot, who for years performed a native faux dance at basketball and football games. Other schools followed. In 1970, more than 3,000 high school, college, and professional sports teams had Native American nicknames or mascots. Today, fewer than 1,000 remain. I am Fripp, and we are kicking ass. For most of the 4 decades that the fight had raged, the R-Word team felt little need to respond to their critics. Now, that's changed dramatically, but that doesn't mean that the team is taking the allegations about its name to heart. To the contrary, their position has hardened, both in Snyder's public remarks and in private discussions about how to respond to inquiries about the controversy. Emails obtained by Think Progress revealed that the team consulted with a group of high-profile Republican advisors, some of whose involvement with the team has not been previously reported, about how to handle this particular reporter's questions about the organization's approach to the campaign to change the team's name. Included in the email chain were Frank Luntz, the Republican messaging consultant famous for phrases like climate change and death tax, Ari Fleischer, who served as the White House press secretary under George W. Bush from 2001 and 2003, and now runs a consulting firm called Ari Fleischer Sports Communications. George Allen, the former Virginia governor and U.S. senator, who now runs the consulting firm George Allen Strategies, and Bruce Allen, George Allen's brother, and the organization's general manager and executive vice president. Both Allens are the son of former R-Word team head coach George Allen. The websites for neither Fleischer's nor Luntz's firms include client lists. The R-Word team's vice president of communication, Tony Wiley, confirmed that while Luntz had conducted a focus group on behalf of the team, he has not been paid for other work with them, and that Fleischer and George Allen's firm do not have contracts with the team. Fleischer, Luntz, and George Allen had not responded to requests for confirmation at the time that this was written. But the fact that the men participated in the email chain is at all revealing. In 2013, when Think Progress first reported Luntz's involvement in the team's efforts to focus group its name, the R-Word team and Luntz actually declined to confirm that Luntz or his firm, Luntz Global, were involved in the project. The email chain shows that after the reporter requested comment on a number of issues related to the R-Word name and claims made by its opponents, Wiley forwarded the email to Luntz, Fleischer, and the Allens. George Allen's response is the first included in the chain, and it suggests that the team reiterated its story about changing its name to honor Lone Star Dietz, even though the team can't prove any of his claims. Quote, the point was that the R-Word team owner at the time obviously believed that Lone Star Dietz was a Native American and named the team to honor Native Americans and be motivated by their heritage. Allen, whose 2006 Senate campaign was marked by allegations about his use of racially charged language, wrote, quote, all the other aspects of the story about Lone Star's adoption and other intrigue and speculation is undoubtedly beyond our ability to discern as to its veracity. Quote, we don't need to comment on all these ignorant requests, Bruce Allen wrote in response. Tell reporter to call the family of the College Hall of Fame coach Dietz and ask them this insulting question. I agree, Fleischer responded. Not that we need to answer any more questions or waste any more time with this outfit. Now, Think Progress's inquiries included questions about the organization's response to the idea that the campaign against its name was now permanent, and the fact that multiple Native American leaders and their allies had suggested that the name change was, quote, inevitable. The others dealt with the trademark lawsuit and the fact that the civil rights group, political leaders, and media figures had criticized the name, and whether the team was aware of the research questioning the veracity of Dietz's Native American heritage. The team's official statement in response to those questions is strikingly different from the email chain. Quote, as a recent national poll showed, the overwhelming majority of Americans agree with our position on the name, which Wiley wrote. An earlier poll by the Annenberg Institute showed that 90% of Native Americans support our name, and that the message we have heard from hundreds of Native Americans who wrote to Dan Snyder in support of the R-Word team. The team's statement included a quotation from a Native American fan in support of the team's name as well. But the team's robust efforts to control the message trace back to last spring, 2013. It was May 10th when USA Today sports reporter Eric Brady asked Snyder whether the name would ever change. Initially, Snyder stuck to the party line. Brady followed up, asking what would happen if the team lost the new trademark suit. Snyder went off script. He delivered the now infamous quote, telling Brady to print his answer, never in all capital letters. We'll never change the name. It's that simple. Never. You can use caps. Months later, D.C. lobbyist, lawyer, and media consultant Lanny Davis, who Snyder had retained to help with communication strategy, said he regretted the tone of Snyder's comment. Quote, we'll never change the name. It's that simple. Never. You can use caps. Since I left the White House, I've helped him on several matters, so I know Dan Snyder. And when I saw the all caps comment, I thought that had the wrong flavor to it. That's what David said during an appearance on a local radio show. I think saying we care about people's feelings, we're respectful when anyone is offended, but we have this 80-year name that we all love. We sing Hail to the R Word every Sunday at the stadium, and we say that we're part of the R Word Nation. That's our vocabulary. Those are terms of honor. And that's what he should have said, but he, I don't think, is going to say, all caps, never again. Though the context of Snyder's quote was in keeping with prior owners' stances, the tone was different. The tone mattered. Snyder's retrenched intransigence made the team's name less an immutable fact of life and more an expression of his personal style. And this was the same combative approach to critics he had taken before, the one that led him to sue both fans who said that the Great Recession had left them financially unable to meet their season ticket obligations, and a local newspaper that criticized him. By stepping out from behind the organizational justifications and the organizational tone for the first time, Snyder made himself an easy target. The team has been trying to shift the conversation ever since last June 2013. Think Progress reported that the communications firm owned by Republican communications guru Frank Luntz at that time held a focus group for people in the Washington area about the R-word name. Last October, Snyder defended the team's name in a letter to fans. In November, the franchise asked its fans via email to contact their member of a D.C. City Council to urge a vote against a resolution that would condemn the team's name. Snyder's new tone in the spring was only part of the reason the team needed to reset the terms of the fight. The other was much larger. In February, a month after the Redskins lost in the playoffs, Harjo organized a symposium at the Smithsonian's Museum of the American Indian. The event brought together activists to talk about American mascots in the R-word backyard, and with little else to do at a slow time in the sporting calendar, the media showed up. Newspaper reporters, local television cameras, and web journalists all listened as Harjo and other activists described their new trademark case, which the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office would hear in March, and explained why they found names like DC teams troublesome. The event spawned a round of media coverage that reintroduced sports fans to an issue that, for the most part, had been out of the national news cycle for years. The timing was perfect. A month later, as a small group of members in Congress prepared legislation that could strip the DC team of their trademark, a school board in Cooperstown, New York, voted to drop the R-word name used by the Cooperstown Central High School. The vote came at the request of students who no longer saw the name as appropriate. The board agreed, although it had a question. How was it going to afford new uniforms, signs, and everything else it would have to refit with whatever new name the school chose? Enter one of the names now synonymous with the R-word controversy. The Oneida Indian Nation of New York heard about Cooperstown and told the school board it could pay for the change. In March, the school board unanimously approved the change. Oneida donated $10,000 to pick up the tab, and there was more. Oneida didn't plan to stop in Cooperstown. There was another, much more notable team using the same name in Washington, and Oneida leader Ray Halbritter wanted them to change too. Oneida is a relatively small tribe in New York, where its people lived before Europeans reached North America. Despite its size, Oneida is financially secure, thanks to a casino and a network of gas stations it owns and operates in upstate New York. In a profile of the newest face taking on the R-word team, the Washington Post described Halbritter as a man loved by supporters for pulling his people out of poverty. Both his proponents and detractors, the Post wrote, acknowledged that he is a formidable adversary who has faced tough fights before, and that is the persona Halbritter brought to Oneida's campaign against the name of Washington's football team. Cooperstown is close to the Oneida tribe in the Washington Post profile, but the students' movement against the name struck Halbritter and Oneida for another reason. There are virtually no Native Americans in Cooperstown. According to the Census Bureau, Otsego County, New York is nearly 95% white. Native Americans make up just 0.2% of the county's population. Native Americans hadn't forced this change. A group of white students who didn't want to exclude another group of Americans had. They were kids, and they did something these billionaire team owners and their $9 billion NFL won't do. That was sort of a shining light moment, a moment of clarity, Alberta said. That was very inspiring to us. NCAI and smaller Native American groups had fought this name for years, both behind the scenes and in public papers and reports. Oneida was familiar with the NFL. The New York tribe sponsors the Buffalo Bills, while its Wisconsin tribe sponsors the Green Bay Packers. And its members may have even been personally offended by the R-word team's name. But the Oneida had never organized around it. That was about to change. The symposium in Washington and the pending trademark case had re-energized the people who had worked to change these names for decades. The Cooperstown decision brought Oneida into the fold, and Oneida brought with it two things the other groups never seemed to have: an organizing strategy that could inject into the cause, into the mainstream, and the money to fund a major advocacy campaign that no one could ignore. Oneida's Change the Mascot campaign, launched in September, marked a shift in the way Native American activists would tell and sell their story. Other events helped set the stage. The 10 members of Congress who introduced the Non-Disparagement of Native American Persons or People in Trademark Registration Act of 2013 in March wrote a letter to Snyder and NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell in May. Goodell responded in June with a letter largely based on the historical claims of honor and tradition the activists had long opposed. In July, America's Samoa's delegate to Congress blasted the name on the House floor, calling the racial implications a moral issue that its defenders had ignored. And right as football season prepared for kickoff, Oneida's campaign launch blew the issue through the roof. The arguments the Oneida made weren't very different from the ones that had been presented before. Natives had used a broad, inclusive message, and they had argued that the mascots create and reinforce stereotypes with long-term consequences. They had even argued that this change was ultimately inevitable. Oneida and its allies orchestrated a fight that looked and acted like an insurgent political campaign. Oneida helped refine these messages and to craft broad media strategy that would take the arguments public in a way that the movement previously hadn't. Over the next 6 months, Oneida and its immediate allies orchestrated a media-driven push that looked and acted like an insurgent political issue campaign. Oneida placed strategic ad buys in cities across the country, where the R-word team were scheduled to play road games during the 2013 season. Taking the issue outside of Washington would get it away from a public predisposed to defend the team and into other communities, some of them like Green Bay and Minneapolis, that were already familiar with Native American issues. The ad buys weren't solely aimed at the public, though. They were also a way to generate free coverage, earned media, that would beget more coverage. Oneida spent thousands of dollars on ads, but it knew that it couldn't go toe-to-toe financially with the Redskins, much less the NFL and its $9 billion in revenues, its own dedicated TV network, and major media influence. Oneida, like any campaign, needed organic help. And in some instances, the campaign used a broad message of racial tolerance that tied Native Americans' fight to those of other racial minorities, particularly when those fights were in the news. Oneida's first ad, targeted for Week 1 of the NFL season, likened the Redskins' name, that one and only name, to the racial slur Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver Riley Cooper used against a black security guard at a concert during the offseason. Cooper's slur was in the news. The Eagles, his teammates, his fellow players, the media, and even Commissioner Roger Goodell condemned his actions. Oneida praised Goodell's response, with Halberter saying that in the first ad that Goodell is absolutely right. This kind of bigotry has no place in America. Then it asked a question. If the NFL had to condemn Cooper's form of bigotry, why did it sanction another? Halberter used Goodell's own words against him, and it worked. The ad generated coverage in mainstream media, and it was both educational and effective. While its campaign focused on a deliberate media strategy, the coalition never lost sight of its educational message. The franchise and its defenders often argued that the R word was merely a name and that Native Americans had larger issues to worry about. Oneida and the other groups countered with research NCAI had pushed for years, showing that these mascots perpetuated harmful stereotypes that had deep psychological and social effects. Leaders like Robert Holden, NCAI's deputy executive director, focused on the religious and cultural background to the issue. Quote, "Look at the antics that were done in the stadium. Fans don fake eagle feathers and they put on fake war paint, and these are things that are part of our culture. Those eagle feathers, they're a sacred item shown to us by the Creator as to how to treat them and how to respect this creature. Some of these feathers are given to warriors and to people who do great things for our community. For these idiots to put these on and jump around like idiots, that's like making fun of religion and our culture. It's part of the education process, making them understand that what they did, what they have done, and what they will continue to do is an affront to us." Halberter framed his fight as one not over a name, but over Native Americans' rights to define themselves. What is more important in life for anyone than their own belief in themselves, Halberter asked. As the campaign progressed, it rapidly picked up allies. USA Today columnist Christine Brennan wrote in September 2013 she'd no longer use the name, and the Post editorial board opined against it. President Obama said in October that he would consider a name change if he owned the team. NBC's Bob Costas devoted a segment and concluded it was a slur. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi said the team should change its name. The D.C. Council unanimously approved a resolution condemning the use of the R word. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid criticized it in December. Along the way, the campaign's broad appeal brought in other civil rights and other religious groups too. The NAACP and ACLU, which had long opposed the name, were part of a coalition of 200 civil rights organizations that condemned the name in December. Members of D.C.'s black clergy pledged to preach against it to the congregation. 60 D.C. area religious leaders from the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities signed a letter to Goodell calling for a name change. I'm Fripp. We are kicking ass. By all indications, Snyder had no interest in being a part of that change. His organization, as it had in the past, continues to lean on public opinion polls to defend the name, citing a recent survey showing that 71% of Americans wanted to keep the name, compared to 18% who wanted to change it. A previous poll by the Associated Press just happened to show those numbers at 79% and 11% respectively. Oneida and other Native American groups counter by arguing that the name should not be subject to public opinion. I don't think this is an issue that you can just vote away, Halberter said. How many people have to be offended for things to change? This is a defined offensive term. Then came June 18th, when the United States Patent and Trademark Office canceled 6 federal trademark registrations for the name of the Washington Redskins, ruling that the name is disparaging to Native Americans and thus cannot be trademarked under federal law that prohibits the protection of offensive or disparaging language. The USPTO's Trademark Trial and Appeal Board issued a ruling in the case brought against the team by plaintiff Amanda Blackhorse. Quote, "We decide, based on the evidence properly before us, that these registrations must be canceled because they were disparaging to Native Americans at the respective times in which they were registered." That's what the board wrote in its opinion. The Trademark Trial and Appeal Board agreed with our clients that the team's name and trademarks disparaged Native Americans. The board ruled that the trademark office should never have registered these trademarks in the first place. Jesse Whitten, the plaintiff's lead attorney, said in a press release, "We presented a wide variety of evidence, including dictionary definitions and other reference works, newspaper clippings, movie clips, scholarly articles, expert linguistic testimony, and evidence of the historic opposition by Native American groups to demonstrate that the word redskin is an ethnic slur." Quote, "I am extremely happy that the board ruled in our favor," Blackhorse said in a statement. "It is a great victory for Native Americans and for all Americans. We filed our petition 8 years ago, and it has been a tough battle ever since. I hope this ruling brings us a step closer to that inevitable day when the name of the Washington football team will be changed. The team's name is racist and derogatory. I've said it before, and I will say it again. If people wouldn't dare call a Native American a redskin because they know it's offensive, how can an NFL football team have this name?" The team will appeal the case, according to a statement from its attorney, and it will be able to keep its trademark protection during appeal. Further, losing the trademark would not force the team to change its name, as the PTO pointed out in its fact sheet about the case. The Trial and Appeal Board does not have jurisdiction in a cancellation proceeding to require that a party cease use of a mark, but only to determine whether a mark continues to be registered. The absence of federal trademark protection, however, could limit the team's legal protection to state and common laws when others use the name, so others can't just start marketing new Redskins merchandise. Still, it could potentially cost the team. And because of the NFL's revenue-sharing model, other NFL teams money. In the previous case, the team's attorneys argued that losing trademark protection and the exclusive right to their brand could cause every imaginable loss you could think of. For that reason, targeting the trademark has been thought of by opponents of the team's name as the easiest avenue to changing it. The team is confident that we will prevail on appeal. We've seen this story before, and just like last time, today's ruling will have no effect at all on the team's ownership of and the right to use the R-word name and logo. Team attorney Bob Rapskoff said in the statement, "We are confident we'll prevail once again and that the Trial and Appeal Board's divided ruling will be overturned on appeal. The case is no different than an earlier case." Thoughts from Keith Olbermann.
Incredible as it sounds, an NFL vice president has asserted both that the term Redskins is not a slur and then added that it is not and never has been intended as a slur, and then circled back and said it is currently not a slur. Just when you thought this hole could not be dug any deeper, another NFL senior vice president, the league's official spokesman, said that Vice President Birch was exactly correct. "The team and our office have always said the name is intended to be positive and respectful," Greg Aiello told ESPN. "Why would you name a sports team otherwise for 80 years? As Adolfo said, our position is the same as it's been." Pause for a moment and wonder at the circularity of Vice President Aiello's statement. Redskins can't be racist because it's been used for 80 years, and if it had been racist, it would have been changed by now, and if Native Americans had no voice in this country to get something like this changed 8 decades ago, they can't have obtained one since, and if it wasn't a slur in 1933, it can't be one in 2014, and that's why we can't change it now. There is the 1990s story of the head of a corporation that fired one of its African-American department heads because he had contracted AIDS. After they lost the lawsuit, and the judge angrily ordered them to pay the dying man, the head of that corporation explained to reporters that the real shame was that people might think he or his firm were racist or homophobic. How could we be prejudiced, he asked, when we hired this man in the first place? This is the level of argument the NFL has today descended to. It's nonsense. It's verbal gymnastics bordering on the inanity of Professor Irwin Corey. Additionally, it comes in the context of the entire defense of this racist, disgusting name having collapsed into the tissue of lies it has always been. As we reported to you last night, a nearly 81-year-old newspaper clipping has turned up in which the founder of the franchise is quoted on the record as explaining the team was not named to honor any Native Americans, but merely to end confusion caused by the team's previous name, the Boston Braves, and the fact that there was also a baseball team called the Boston Braves. That argument that the nickname was meant to honor a supposedly Native American coach or player, that is the essence of the defense of the use of the name as the team name. It is the defense used both by the franchise and by the NFL. It is the skimpiest fig leaf, and this week it fell off. And instead of addressing the collapse of this rationalization for this evil name, the NFL, through Mr. Birch and Mr. Aiello, have declared that it is, at best, the de facto position of the league that the term, quote, Redskins, unquote, is not a slur. I call on Commissioner Roger Goodell to repudiate and correct the remarks of Vice President Birch and Vice President Aiello, or to state that the league will now finally begin the process of changing the name of the Washington franchise, because otherwise, right now, the league has already decided it's not a slur means not just no change, but no possible change, and that any dialogue on the subject of change is a farce. In that circumstance, there would be no cause for opponents of the name to behave cooperatively with the NFL, nor cause for anyone dealing with the NFL on any matter of substance to believe that the league is operating in good faith. If the commissioner fails to correct this inflexible and adamantine position, he will be positioning the National Football League thusly. It would be defending an objectionable, heartbreaking, slanderous, racist term while maintaining a fiction of dialogue about that term. And it would be showing an utter lack of sensitivity, an utter lack of self-awareness, an utter lack of understanding of what we as a society have done to the natives of this continent for more than 400 years, and what we do to them every time we use this term.
There is something tragic about the fact that financial interest will, one way or another, ultimately decide the fate of a name that so many Native Americans have fought so long to change. There's no financial solution to a moral problem, Ray Halberter said. Just because you're a billionaire doesn't give you the right to use a racial slur. Thanks to this report by Travis Waldron of Think Progress. While we await the Supreme Court's decision in the Hobby Lobby case, yes, while we await for that, let's take another look at its self-righteous victimhood, who in this case thinks that they should not pay for your lady pills. Yes, indeed. Yes. By Joan McCarter, writing in The Great Orange Satan, kind of goes like this. Meet the family behind Hobby Lobby and their plans for a Christian nation. The U.S. Supreme Court has yet to release its decision on Sebelius versus Hobby Lobby, the challenge to Obamacare's mandate that employers provide health insurance to employees covering birth control. Hobby Lobby argues that having to provide this coverage, which includes birth control methods they consider to be abortifacients because they have such a good grasp of medical science, is a violation of their religious freedom. Now, if Hobby Lobby is to prevail in the suit, the court will have endorsed a very scary version of religious freedom that in essence is about freedom of religion for fundamentalist Christians to impose their beliefs on the rest of the nation. Now, that's certainly what the Greens, the family behind Hobby Lobby, hope to achieve with the millions that they have made in the hobby and crafts chains of stores, along with a bunch of projects, including an $800 million museum in Washington, D.C., dedicated to the Bible, they hope to rewrite the nation's public school curriculum. Now, most provocatively, they've funded a multi-million-dollar effort to write a Bible curriculum they hope to place in public schools nationwide. It will debut next fall as an elective in Mustang High School, a few miles from Hobby Lobby's Oklahoma City headquarters. Now, a draft of the textbook for the first 4 planned year-long courses presents Adam and Eve as historical figures and introduces God as faithful and good, gracious and compassionate, and an ever-present help in the times of trouble. A list of curses for disobeying the Lord warns of defeat, fever, and disaster and panic in everything you do. Now, our goal is to reintroduce the book to the nation, said Steve Green, the president of Hobby Lobby, who said last spring before the National Bible Association, "This nation is in danger because of its ignorance of what God has taught. We need to know it, and if we don't know it, our future is going to be very scary." Now, religious freedom for me, but only for thee, if you agree with me. The premise behind the museum and the curriculum is that the Bible is a reliable historical source, and that when it applies to our lives in all aspects of life, it has been good. Perhaps the Greens are using Hobby Lobby as the test case, just to see how much they can get away with this in court. And since their textbooks would surely be challenged as unconstitutional in any way if they were ever to be adopted by a district, this case is the first foray into national politics, and forwards into a conviction that has come to the Greens only recently. Yes. Now, before the contraceptive coverage was included in federal law, don't forget that the Greens apparently had no problem with it. Their employer-sponsored health plans covered it until 2012 when they decided to sue over Obamacare. Their deeply held religious beliefs also apparently ends at the bottom line. The company's retirement plan also includes mutual funds that have stock holdings in companies that manufacture the drugs and devices they believe their employees should not have access to through their insurance. Yes, those religious convictions are deeply held. Yes, the court will be ruling on Hobby Lobby anytime. But for the sake of religious freedom for the whole nation, let's just hold out hope that the justices just shut that whole thing down.
Hey, bullies, look behind you. It's kicking ass. Tuesdays, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific.
Or 11.
Find us on Stitcher, Spreaker, Swell, Netrootsradio.com. Never forget, we win when we fight back, kicking ass.
Remember, the after show is in this time slot the rest of this week and Mondays. We'll be back next Tuesday. Tom Hartman live next. Sam Cedar live with Ring of Fire. Democracy Now! Carl in the morning and the afternoon, followed by Mike Malloy live. 12 to 14 hours of live progressive talk and issues right here and more on netrootsradio.com. Voices of America. Thanks for listening.